Good evening and welcome to Shaker, Weaving, and Textiles with Melissa Weaver Dunning. Loudoun County Public Library is pleased to be partnering with the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge to bring you this program tonight. I'm Lorraine Moffa, Programming Coordinator at Loudoun County Public Library and your host tonight. Please feel free to share with me your comments and questions for the speaker by typing them in the chat box. I can then relay them to Melissa at the end of her presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Weaver Dunning. She is a traditional hand weaver and spinner with 40 years of experience working on antique equipment to produce 18th and 19th century style textiles. Melissa began her traditional textile study with Scottish master weaver Norman Kennedy and carries on this rich tradition in her own teaching. Melissa is an avid tartan and linen weaver and a lover of wool who loves sharing her passion for weaving and spinning with her students. Welcome, Melissa, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. So I like to begin this lecture with a long quote from the book, A Shaker Family Album. This is a book of mostly photographs, but the introduction by David R. Starbucks is a really nice, concise background into the Shakers. So it begins, the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, better known as the Shakers, was founded in Manchester, England in the mid-18th century. The movement was then taken to America in 1774 by its early prophetess, Mother Ann Lee, and grew to encompass some 19 villages in the eastern United States. As a religion that never had more than 5,000 or 6,000 members at a time, and that today has just a handful of adherents in one village, Shakerism has given rise to a truly amazing wealth of religious writings, sacred music and dance, craft manufactures, and furniture. From 18th century England until today, Shakerism has been a Christian communal society whose distinctly dressed members believe in the sharing of property, pacifism, celibacy, and the equality of men and women. They do not vote or bear arms, but are obedient to the millennial laws of the Shaker Society. In the absence of sex and marriage, new members necessarily arrived from among the world's people and converted, but many others were orphans who had been placed with the Shakers as children and later chose to join when they reached maturity. At their peak, Shaker communities provided peaceful environments in pleasant rural settings, but each village rarely had more than a few hundred members at a time. It was explicitly recognized that the Shaker way of life was not for everyone. Shakerism is often viewed as a response to the difficulties of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, and as a phenomenon that did not outlast that era. While it is true that membership was in serious decline after 1850, the Shaker faith has shown itself to be remarkably resilient and long-lasting. 20th century Shakerism continues to have its own distinctive character, and the Shakers of the past 100 years have adopted much from the outside world, including automobiles, televisions, and modern kitchen appliances. And their recent history is generally well understood because it has been recorded so thoroughly in journals, church records, photographs, interviews, and television documentaries. The beginning was not easy. There was persecution, impoverishment, imprisonment. The converts came with a wave of religious revivalism in the later years of the Revolution. June Sprigg wrote of Mother Ann, the order and comfort of her vision appealed to people weary of war and uncertain of the future of the new republic. There was a long decline of communities after the Civil War. People continued to join, but more children chose to leave, and around the turn of the century, state orphanages were created and the children's order dwindled. At Canterbury, New Hampshire, there were 97 members in 1899, and by 1970, just 6 elderly Shaker sisters. A nonprofit educational corporation was founded and professional staff hired who transformed Canterbury Village into a virtual living museum until the last sister died in 1992. The Shakers were very self-sufficient and they created high-quality goods. All tasks were worthy of the skill of the worker. Mother Ann said, "Do all your work as though you had 1,000 years to live and as if you knew you must die tomorrow." And she was also known for saying, "Put your hands to work and your hearts to God. The Shakers were known for successful farming practices, introducing new breeds. All the communities were self-sufficient, but they sold their excess goods to the world's people, including butter, vegetable seeds, fruit, maple sugar products, herbs, and patent medicines. Baskets, weavers, washing machines, brooms, wooden pails, sewing boxes, Dorothy cloaks, socks, and later sweaters. The Shakers were also known for a remarkable number of inventions. They invented the flat broom. Before that, all brooms had been round. The circular saw, the dough mixer, the washing machine, vacuum pan, chair tips, in which a person could lean their chair back without compromising its security on the floor, a kind of ball and socket kind of arrangement. The revolving chair, a revolving oven that would bake 60 pies at once, wrinkle-resistant fabric, the double rolling pin, seed sowers, seed tape, shellers, peelers, a 5-prong pen for writing musical staves, single-line music notation, paper seed packets, the curved tailor's yardsticks, a water-powered wind fan, pill-form medicine, and related equipment, tools for splitting poplar shavings for weaving, a telescoping metal pen, efficient barns, and other buildings. And this is a picture of the round barn at the Hancock Village in Western Massachusetts. And this wonderful anatomy of that barn, so you can see how it's laid out. And one of the main features is having the cattle live on a floor that had a slatted floor so that the manure fell down into a lower level where it was easily accessed to be used for fertilizing the fields. And interestingly, George Washington had a similar barn that he designed himself at Mount Vernon that you can see if you visit there. The 1820 Meeting House at Pleasant Hill, Kentucky has a unique architectural structure found in many large Shaker buildings, including a truss system which allows the beams in the attic to hold up the second floor. This avoids the use of pillars or beams on the main floor and allows a more efficient use of space throughout the building, and also allows an unobstructed space for the movement and dancing featured in Shaker workshop services. And we're actually looking at the large dwelling house at Hancock, which is built of a similar construction as the Pleasant Hill Meeting House. Water power was used as early as 1850 to run looms, winders, sewing, and knitting machines. And this is one of the main shops at Hancock, with a lot of machines that were powered first by steam and later by electricity. One of the interesting things about the Shakers is the equality of the sexes. Very, very early for its time, men and women lived separately in families and were governed by 2 elders and 2 eldresses in each family. They also believed in racial equality. Slave owners who joined were forced to free their slaves, and the slaves were encouraged to join the Shakers. There was a Black family at South Union, Ohio, and a group of Black sisters in Philadelphia. Both groups eventually became part of larger villages and families without any apparent discord. Shaker design was defined by utility, simplicity, and proportion. Thomas Merton attributed the peculiar grace of a Shaker chair to the maker's belief that an angel might come and sit on it. The Shakers did not make that which was not useful, presaging the famous statement from William Morris, "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." Historic Shaker communities that are now modern museums include the Alfred Shaker Museum and Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village in Maine, Canterbury Shaker Village and Enfield Shaker Museum in New Hampshire, the Fruitlands Museum Shaker Museum, Hancock Shaker Village, and Shirley Shaker Village in Massachusetts, the New Lebanon Shaker Village and the Shaker Heritage Society in New York, the Shaker Historical Museum at North Union Shaker Heights, the Warren County Historical Society, and Whitewater Shaker Village in Ohio, and the Shaker Village of Pleasant Hill and the Shaker Museum at South Union in Kentucky. And we're looking here at a building in Pleasant Hill. And one of the really exciting things about Pleasant Hill is that you can book a room and stay in a Shaker building. And this is the building that I stayed in when I went there to do research. one of the exciting things about Pleasant Hill is this double elliptical staircase, which I thought I'd be able to photograph both staircases, but it's pretty hard to get at them. I think the pictures I've seen in books must have used scaffolds, but you get the idea. There are these two staircases that spiral away from one another. All of the buildings have pairs of doors, separate staircases. They were designed to allow men and women to remain separate and to have their own areas. Although they did come together in some areas of work and certainly in their worship. And this is a map of the Hancock Shaker village, and you can see the round barn there and other wonderful buildings. And we're going to look at some things at Hancock now. This is an interior shot from that large dwelling house with the pairs of doors. Lots of beautiful built-in cabinetry and drawers for storage. And here we get into my particular area of interest, which is fiber and textiles. So these are two, actually one of these is well, how many wheels are there? There are two great wheels in the background, and in the foreground is not actually a spinning wheel, but a pern winder, a spool winder for winding the bobbins and spools used in warping and in weaving. These are baskets in the larder area. And here we have a set of towels, and these are reproduction towels. And the reason that the person we have to thank for the presence of these towels at the museums is Mary Elva Erf, who did a great deal of research. She designed and created all the textiles for a special shaker room that's part of the permanent display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And she started teaching classes on shaker linens. And in the beginning, she told her students that they could either pay her fee or they could commit to weaving and donating a towel to a museum. And now there are dozens and dozens of towels at each of the museums. And it may seem like a small thing, but when you see them in situ like this, in the kitchens, in the dwelling rooms, it's very exciting. It gives you more of a feel as though the people who lived there had just left moments before. And as a weaver, of course, it's very exciting. This is another shaker invention. It's this shape of wood stove is particular to them, but also this wood stove with an insert that held what are called sad irons. This is how they pressed their clothes, and you needed to have a rotation of irons. So you could have two warming. Well, you used one you'd just taken out and then rotate them as the irons cooled. And this is in the room that was the sisters' tailoring shop. And they have these wonderful work tables that are at a good and comfortable height with a lot of built-in drawers. And the little platform to the right there has a tool on it that's used for measuring the hems of ladies' dresses or cloaks. And here we have some of the tailoring tools that they developed to do their work. And this is a pair of sisters' sewing tables that were generally used like this, faced back to back. And they're very clever and efficient. And this is a dwelling room. One of the other things shakers are known for are these peg rails that go around the perimeter of the room. And they're used to hang a mirror or a drying rack or a garment. And also sometimes in winter used to hang a cloth that would provide a little bit more insulation. And now we're going to start looking at weaving. So this is one of the two rooms in the weaving shop at Hancock. And you can see the barn frame loom at the back, the old frame style. And there's a smaller loom in the front that we'll see that style closer up that is peculiar to shakers. But first, we're going to look at chair tape. So one of the things the shakers are known for is their beautiful chairs. And they provided chairs that had a woven cloth tape used for the seat. And this is a chair being held in a jig so that it's at a comfortable height for the person weaving the seat. And they have this kind of large, flat, curved sewing needle that's used to weave the tape into place. And the jig has a variety of pivots on it so that you can get at the bit of chair. So you can turn it upside down and right side up as you work. And these are rolls of tape in that shop. So they wove the tape on this small loom. And it was just used for narrow strips that were somewhere between maybe 5/8 of an inch and probably about 1 3/4 wide. And the design is similar to the basic frame loom, but they took the back upright and brought it forward at an angle. And it's an interesting and also really effective design. And you can see the back of it has a curved warp beam. They just used the area where the white cloth is. They didn't weave beyond that point. This kind of loom, it just has 2 treadles. It's just for very plain weaving, and it's designed to make these tapes, which are then woven into chair seats. And this is a very handsome twill chair seat. Here we have a plain weave seat, but it's alternating a blue plain tape with a fancier striped tape. And these are some older tapes that are in some of the museums. And some of them are kind of plain, even though they're fancy. But you can see a little bit more of the complexity of the design, even though it reads as a fairly simple design. When I was at Hancock, they had just received these 2 cases back that they'd loaned to another museum for a display. And if you look carefully, you can see darker and brighter areas on the tapes, which show you where they were overlapped and the colors were protected from sunlight, and then sections where the colors were faded, particularly on the blue one to the right, which has a nearly green, pale green section, which is what happened to that blue dye when it was in the sun.
Melissa, may I interrupt you a
yeah.
moment for a
Yeah.
question? What type of fiber did they use in the chair tape?
The chair tapes were woven predominantly with cotton, although they did weave some wool tapes for rugs, for rug binding, and we'll see some of those a little later. This is an unusual twill tape, and there are a few of those. And this is a twill tape that is the fanciest that I've seen. It has twisted pairs of threads of different colors twisted together and solid colors. Now we're going to look at rugs. And I'm starting with this rug, which is kind of a typical rag rug that you can still buy today. These are kind of ubiquitous in America and really throughout Europe. And the Shakers, let me just point out right now that the items found in the Shaker museums many of them are items that were manufactured by the Shakers, but when a family joined the Shakers, they brought all their worldly goods with them, and those goods were put to use. So they do sometimes find items that would not have been woven by the Shakers, but clearly came from the community with a family that joined. So this is just a typical rag rug. It's got a cotton or linen warp, the skinny threads that you just barely see, and those are wound onto the loom. And then it has rags that are woven into that warp. And this is what I would call a hit or miss rug. You just had a lot of rags, sewed them together, and used them as they came to hand. And they have some of these rugs that are just a little bit different, still 2-harness plain weave, but by alternating a light and a dark color and periodically putting 2 dark colors or 2 light colors together in sequence, you get this kind of interesting graphic look. And this is it closer, that same rug. And then here's another one that has a very strong graphic look, but the same effect. It's a very simple loom, but kind of a fancy rug. But what the Shakers are known for is for using a combination of rags and yarn in their rugs. Now, there are a few of their rugs that are twisted yarns used together. So this would be a white, a blue, and a red yarn twisted together, and that group of 3 yarns would have been used to weave this rug. And here's another one that is just yarn. But then we have lots and lots of really beautiful, striking rugs that have a combination of rags, the black, the red, the blue, and there's a kind of pinkish gray color in here. And between them are groups of twisted yarns. This particular design is not seen from any other ethnic group or region in American weaving. It's unique to the Shakers. And in some cases, it's quite dramatic. So this is a particularly Shaker style. And this design was also sometimes called turkey tracks, where when they twisted the yarns together, they turned the wheel clockwise to create an S twist, which is predominantly upper left to lower right. And then the next group of rags, they would turn the wheel counterclockwise to get a Z twist that would go upper right to lower left. And by alternating these in the rug, they create a kind of chevron pattern. This is also a really lovely example of this combination of rags and twisted yarns. So even though we think of the Shakers as being simple people in terms of their dress, in their decor, they put a great deal of creativity and artistry into their choices. So this has red and white twisted rags, blue rags, red rags, green rags, all of these things used together. And you can see this one up close. And then they used a variety of bindings. So they sometimes wove a fancy tape to use to bind the edges of the rug to keep it from coming apart. Sometimes they used braided rug, just a strip of braided wool. And some of these rugs are predominantly wool, the materials. They would use a cotton or linen warp, but the rags would have been wool rags. This has a very fancy edge, which I think was added later, kind of as an afterthought. Wouldn't this look pretty? Let's try it out. And this is just a very plain twill tape binding for what's actually a really lovely rug. And this is a very unusual rug. It's completely woven of velvet and has a fancy velvet binding on the edges. And there isn't really anything known about who wove it. It's in the Hancock collection. And it was just an idea that a weaver had. What would happen if I did this? Or I imagine that the draperies that they used for their small stage there had gotten old or sun faded, and they wanted to use that fabric for something. So it got recycled into a rug. And this is an unusual rug that turned up at Hancock. It's a twill pattern. And because it has damaged areas, for a textile researcher, it's very exciting when there's an area where the threads have been exposed, because it helps you understand more about the structure of how this was woven and the materials that were used. In some rugs, you wouldn't really see the warp threads at all, for instance, or the weft. One or the other might be hidden by one. And so this is an exciting moment for a researcher. And a local weaver has been weaving reproductions of that pattern in a couple of different colors, and this is one of her rugs. So we're going to move on to a few unusual rugs. This is in Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. These are my friends who were researching with me. And this is a knitted rug that is very simple, knitted with, I think, cotton rags. And it's just a series of short rows to make a wedge, and then a garter strip stitch on the edging. Garter has enough stretch that you can compress the inner circle and the outer circle will still lie flat. And here's a little close-up of this. So these are cotton rags, probably from clothing. And this is an unusual rug from Canterbury in New Hampshire that has a braided rug center and then 3 strips of garter strip of rag that's used to fill it out to the size.
Hey, Melissa, did they
Yeah.
use anything along the sides of the loom to keep the sides straight?
Well, they would have used what's called a temple or a stretcher, or the old term is tenterhooks. And that would hold it's a pivoting piece with teeth at the end that stretch the weaving out to keep it at the same width as the threads coming through the reed. But they didn't weave a kind of reinforcement on the loom. And actually, when you weave with rags, you've got a thicker and a thinner weft, you're always going to have a pretty bumpy edge, the selvage edge, because those thicker materials, when they turn a corner, they're going to stick out a little bit more. So I think part of why they bound the rugs was to smooth that kind of unsightly edge. And this is a very unusual rug. It's a knitted shirred rug, and it's made entirely with recycled lisle stockings, cotton, a fine knit cotton that was used for women's stockings all throughout the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And this is the back of it. And I found directions for how to make this kind of rug in a Nova Scotia publication. And just a close-up of all the nubs of all those different rags. So there's a foundation that's a cotton, really kind of a string-like cotton, and then all of these rags are worked in. Let me go back to the beginning. And it's kind of a funny, shaggy rug. And this one was knitted in 3 panels and stitched together. There's a kind of a darker mix of colors at the edge with a red stripe, and that is stitched on to, that's some of that outer edge, and that's attached to the rest. Okay, so we're going to move on to linens, and the term linens in the world of weaving refers not just to things made of linen, but to items that were used for the table, in the kitchen, kind of utilitarian items. So towels, napkins, tablecloths, all that kind of thing. And they might know about, they might be made of linen or cotton. And here's another one of these reproduction towels. And we get to see a close-up of that. This pattern, this is a huck. That's the structure that makes the lacy pattern in the center. And this is linen. And this is in the kitchens at Hancock. And for me as a weaver, to go to this village and see all these towels in use, and even see that some of them have been used and they're a little dirty, I really can't explain how exciting that is for a weaver. There are also towels near the washstands. And towels were some of the ones that are have embroidered monograms, probably came in with people who joined the Shakers, because they would be more likely to put a room number on a piece of linen that belonged to a room than to use initials. And here's a whole rack of towels. And then a close-up of the one on the right. This is a Bronson weave, which is another type of spot weave, a kind of lace. And this is the dogwood pattern that the Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, this was known to be woven there, and people came to purchase items woven out of that fabric. And then also at Pleasant Hill, they have a large collection of kerchiefs. So we'll see later a kind of a bib called a Bertha that the Shaker women in New England wore, but I think they wore these kerchiefs more in the South and also sold them to the world's people. And interestingly, a lot of the kerchiefs have 2 colors of yarn twisted together to make these kind of stripes that are both kind of subtle but also have some movement to them. And they also use thick and thin threads to make these very simple patterns. This is the only kerchief I've seen that's been hemmed into this shape, and I'm still wondering about exactly why this happened. If part of it got damaged, or if for some reason somebody wanted to make 2 kerchiefs out of a larger one, but here it is. And you can see the way the rolled hem was made, where the cut was. And this is an interesting kerchief with blue stripes running in one direction and red stripes in the other. And when you get closer, you can see that they're actually, again, twisted yarns, a pair of yarns twisted together, red and white going horizontally and blue and red going vertically. And this is just a particularly striking design, very simple, but really effective. And you find this kind of designs on handkerchiefs also. Now we'll look at some blankets or coverlets. I began my my life as a weaver, weaving full-size bed blankets, and they have a warm spot in my heart. Also, I just love these very simple two-color patterns. Now, blankets were woven on looms that were a maximum of 45 inches wide. And with some finishing, that cloth would probably come down to about 42 inches. So to make a bed blanket, they would weave that full width, but twice as long as what they wanted the blanket to be, fold it over and stitch one of those long sides and cut that fold open, and then it would open up like a book into a large blanket made of two rectangles. So here we're looking at the seam, and I have to say this weaver was quite skilled to come that close to matching all those stripes. And here's a group of blankets on a big rack up in Canterbury. And another blanket. This is just a 4-shaft goose eye twill. It's a very simple pattern, but it makes this simple kind of window pane check look much fancier. And this was a blanket in the collection in Kentucky. All these blues would have been indigo dyed. With indigo, you usually dye with a series of dips, and a few dips would give you a lighter color, and more dips would give you darker colors. So this is quite a deep indigo and white. And now we're going to look at some overshot coverlets. This is a very simple, small figured pattern, but it would be quite nice. And if you kind of lean off to one angle, you can see that it creates a series of diamonds. The white areas actually make the diamonds. The overshot is very optic. So this is a very simple blue and white, probably a linen warp, which would mean it was one of the oldest coverlets. People used cotton just as soon as commercial cotton was available. All those spinners turned their backs on linen and embraced cotton. It took an entire year from seed to having linen thread to work with. To work with linen, and being able to buy cotton was an extraordinary efficiency. This is an overshot pattern. It's not quite symmetrical. I'd like to know what happened to this pattern, but it's interesting nonetheless. It may have been quite intentional because it has a sort of larger effect of waves, but up close it looks a bit odd. This is a much more kind of modern, three-colored, fancier kind of overshot coverlet. And then this is quite fancy and quite blocky. I think a lot of the southern coverlets, this is kind of design was appealing. Oop, and that's all for the blankets. So I just have a few pieces of clothing. This dress I was really taken with because of the use of thick and thin threads that appear in particular places in the garment. It's a very simple dress. Not, very light, that light brown and brown stripes, very plain in some ways, but this little bit of cording and the way it appears. And this is a typical sleeve for this period, middle to late 1800s, because it allowed more freedom of movement without having to use very much fabric. A little gusset underneath the arm, and then this shaped sleeve would allow women to work easily. And dresses at this time did not usually have self-fabric hems where you just turned up the fabric and stitched it into place, but they would be hemmed with a hem tape, which was designed because this would be the dirtiest area of the skirt and the place most likely to receive wear as a woman walked around. And the hem tape could be replaced without having to replace the more valuable dress fabric. So this isn't necessarily the first hem tape that this garment had. And I put this picture in here so you can see these ladies. These are Shaker women and children from the Sabbath Day Maine community. And you see the bibbed tops that the women are wearing. They were very careful in their dress to hide kind of male and female body parts. So women wore these large bibs that sort of smoothed over their bodice, And there's a particular design of trousers for men that had an unusually baggy backside area. So any any thoughts one might have by looking at the body of another person were they were very well camouflaged. And so this Bertha was a very typical part of their clothing design. And this is a particularly nice kind of window pane fabric Bertha, very light. And the next one, I'm sure there was a dress that went with this. So this one has snaps underneath the button panel. So the buttons are just decorative, and it has a light amount of lace and a very simple kind of satin ribbon. And this is the lace edging at the top. And I would bet that is a machine-made lace. So the Shakers weren't afraid to or unwilling to buy products that they could get more cheaply from the world, from manufacturers. And this is a lovely little apron. And I'm not sure if this fabric was hand woven or not. And the reason I include it is because of this inscription, MCC Grove from KH, aged 7 years. And I'm sure that the 7-year-old child sewed this apron and made it for a friend, probably another girl or an older sister who worked with her. But it's one of those moments that makes all this kind of seem more real to us. And this is a dress in the collection at Pleasant Hill. And I am completely smitten with this dress because it has so many stories to tell. And most of them, we don't know the details, but this dress, someone loved this dress. It was either worn by one woman for many, many years or passed on and worn by numerous women, but it was mended and mended and mended. It's just extraordinary, the amount of effort that went into keeping this garment in circulation. Almost the entire underarm and lower sleeve has been replaced. Sections of the front, the skirt actually held up pretty well. You can see all the patching on the sleeves and the side. They practically rebuilt the whole bodice. And it's so well done and so carefully matched. It's not invisible, but it's very subtle. And then the lining itself, there are these blue and white striped duck areas reinforcing the armholes, and a separate fabric, completely different fabric that was used for the lining. And then this is one of those moments where a textile researcher gets excited, because I could see that the fabric had a kind of two-tone iridescent appearance. It's made out of linen. It's a very fine linen. And this allows me to see that the warp was blue and the red was the weft. And some of that indigo warp has faded to a pale, pale green, and some of the red has faded to almost a pinky yellow. So there's quite a bit of color variation in it. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was poplar cloth, which is the Shakers designed a particular loom, and it is much the same shape as the loom that we saw that they designed for their chair tape, but a larger scale. And this loom just had 2 harnesses, and it was made for making poplar cloth. Now, if you think of matchstick shades, which are a very fine thread with very thin strips of bamboo woven into it, they used poplar bark, and they had tiny little planes or a tool similar to a plane that was made specifically to make consistent sized strips of this bark. And you can see a pile of those pieces of bark. I think they tied them into bundles and then slipped them out as they needed them. And the woman who's weaving, who's sitting at the loom, is wearing a bonnet made of poplar cloth. And there's a bonnet hanging, and also, I think, a mat at the very top of the loom. And then we'll see some items made out of this fabric. So this is a poplar cloth loom. This is in Canterbury, New Hampshire. And it has that unusually angled back beam. And these are some items from the Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. So this is a bonnet with that satin, silk satin ruffle at the bottom, which would be particularly valuable for Southern women to keep the sun off their necks. This was definitely designed to be sold to the world's people rather than worn by the Shakers. It's just a bit too fancy. But here we have two bonnets and also a little sewing basket. This is another basket. And a lot of these poplar cloth items were made specifically to be sold to the world's people. And here's this little tiny sewing basket. And it has, all of this is done on a very simple two harness loom, but this has some pieces that were overshot, that went over several threads, and then sections where the poplar cloth goes over and under every thread just to make a little bit more of a design. And this one, as many of the sewing baskets came with its own little needle book. So you might have a series of accessories to go with that sewing kit. And in the background, we can see a couple of different styles of pin cushions and things like that. And this is the cupola on one of the barns at Hancock. I really love the angles and lines of this kind of architecture. And then we're going to finish up with some sheep. So that is the whole of my slideshow. And should I stop my share?
Oh, no, leave it on the sheep. That's a lovely image.
Okay, that's great.
That was so fascinating, Melissa. Thank you. And if anybody has a question, please feel free to type it in the chat box or raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone. You can ask Melissa directly. Oh, we do have one question. How did they cut or create the rag strips?
I believe they would have been cut with scissors. I have not seen, modern rug hookers can buy a device that is made to cut strips, and it has a little round cutting blade. And the fancier ones, you can cut several strips at once. I haven't seen any tools like that in the Shaker collections. And so I think that was a job that was probably given to children or to older women who could use scissors, but had a somewhat limited mobility. So people were always collecting rags, and they would cut them into strips and roll the strips into balls and save them to be used.
That's really cool. Did they raise particular breeds of sheep?
They raised what was kind of most efficient. I know that they did get involved in raising merino sheep, which were a new and terrifically helpful addition to New England. When the merino sheep arrived in the early days of North America, there were sheep here, but they weren't particularly good wool producers. And it took a while after the revolution for things to really settle down, for people to get down to animal husbandry and really try and improve their breeds. But part of that improvement always involved bringing in new breeds. So the arrival of the merino sheep in New England was a big deal, and they were considered very valuable and produced a very fine wool, but also an abundance of wool. And I know they raised other breeds as well.
Okay, one of our attendees is interested in doing historic Shaker weaving and research. Do you have either contact information for yourself or someone else that she might write to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to hear from anyone on that topic or anything related to this. Should I just give you my email?
Please, I'll put it in the chat box for everybody.
Okay, it's weaverdun, WEAVERDUN, @AOL.com.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melissa, for sharing that. What type of research are you and or others doing now about Shaker's textiles?
Well, I've had the opportunity to go into these actually two textile collections. When we visited Canterbury, it was a Sunday and they didn't have a staff member who could take us behind the scenes. So the next thing I'd like to do when things open up a bit more is to go to more Shaker museums and just see what they have in their collections. And it's one of the interesting things I discovered at Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, was that, so I mentioned early in the talk about Canterbury, that the Canterbury Museum in New Hampshire was a living history museum with the last 6 Shaker sisters there. And they would, go about their lives, and people who visited the museum would sometimes see the sisters. Whereas Pleasant Hill in Kentucky, the community diminished to the point where they sold the property into private hands, and it had several owners and was used for a variety of different purposes. And eventually, a group of people in that area decided that it would be a shame to let it go, basically. And they formed a foundation, bought the property, and started the museum. So the Pleasant Hill Museum started with no artifacts, or hardly any. Some items had been auctioned into the community and were donated back or purchased. But the other Shaker museums in the United States donated portions of their collections to Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. And so some of their items are from that community, but some of them are not. They're Shaker, but not necessarily from Kentucky. So chasing things down to that level is pretty interesting.
That is interesting. Another question, as a rag rug crafter, I'd like to learn more about the techniques shown in your pictures. Can you recommend anywhere to find out more?
I mentioned Mary Elva Earth, and she has a book on linen weaving that is out of print and hard to find.
What
But
is her name again, Melissa? Can you?
it's Mary, Mary,
Uh,
Elva, Elva, and her last name is ERF.
F as in Frank?
Yep.
Okay.
And she published a book on Shaker rugs about 4 or 5 years ago, and that book should be available. Trying to see. It's called Weaving Shaker Rugs, and it was published by Schiffer Press in 2015.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about collecting Shaker crafts? Is it even possible? Are they all in museums at this point? Do you find them in places like flea markets or antique stores? What are the prices like?
Yeah, I don't know of, I know that there are private collections of a variety of things. Collectors tend to be interested in a particular thing like chairs or textiles. I don't know of any private collectors of textiles. And so what I've done is contact the curators of museums and ask if I could come and look at their textile archives. And for the most part, they've been very generous. So, and it's worth knowing that there has been a Shaker Museum and Research Center and Library in Chatham, New York. And it was open to the public, and I was able to visit there, but not to do any research. I was just passing through the area. And since that time, they closed to the public. And there were plans of creating a large museum in oh lordy, what's it called? Mount Lebanon in New York, which is just over the Western Massachusetts border. And there's a huge, really remarkable bank barn there that they were going to renovate into a museum, but it's proved impossible. Just the physical structure, the expense that they would have to go to make that structure safe is impossible. So they've shifted their plans. And this Chatham Museum, it's just known as the Shaker Museum, is now has a storefront in Chatham, New York, which is a fairly small, pretty cute town. And they're mounting exhibits there. Right now, they have little pop-up exhibits. But the plan is and so the Chatham collection was made by a man who had it's not on the site of an old museum, but it's a man who lived locally and saw these communities closing and saw their goods being auctioned off and thought that someone should hold on to this piece of history. And so he amassed an extraordinary collection, and they now have a building, and they're going to be establishing a museum there. So that's going to be yet another great research opportunity, but also just a place to visit and see objects.
That sounds really neat. When did you say that should be ready?
Well, I don't know. They have a website.
Okay, what's that called?
Actually, I bumped into them recently. I'm just looking real quick.
Sure.
I bumped into them recently because a shaker mitten pattern showed up on Ravelry, and they did a shaker mitten knit along.
Well, that
And
sounds
it
neat.
turned out, yeah, it was pretty cool. And it turned out that they were, that was done by one of the curators at the museum there. Okay, give me some more shaker museums, please.
Sure.
Yeah, just Shaker Museum. Give me your website. Um, so they ran a series of programs to go along with this mitten.
Pattern.
Okay, so the mitten knit along, and they did a program about women in shakers and modern shakers and shakers raising sheep, and it was, so I learned a little bit more about this museum. So the website for that particular museum is shakermuseum.us.
.us?
US.
Oh,
And at this point, there is the New Lebanon community, which was the first community in the United States. Is part of that is owned by a school, but you can do a self-guided tour of the buildings, just the exteriors of the buildings there. And the Shaker Museum has an administrative campus, and they will have a museum at some point. So the New Lebanon, New York, there's a historic site there, and Old Chatham, New York is where the administrative campus and the research library is. And I don't know. You should go to the website and look.
so if somebody wants to try and replicate some of these patterns and techniques and arts, and they want to connect with other groups doing the same, do you know any groups to put them in touch with?
Well, what I do as
Communities?
a weaving teacher, I teach a class on shaker linens, and I have a class on shaker rugs. And I also do talks like this, only with a whole lot more rugs, a whole lot more textiles in the images. So those are available to weavers guilds or weaving schools. The best thing to do really for weavers is to connect. You can connect with me directly. You can connect with a local guild. And here in Loudoun County, the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge has regular meetings. They're virtual at this point, but they will be, live in person again when we're all ready for that. And that's a good way to meet people who have similar interests and learn, how to find out more about historic weaving.
Interesting. So another question, what did the Shakers use to stuff the chairs and keep them comfortable? I have not found a way to keep the weaving tight enough or filled enough to remain comfortable for years on end.
Yeah, it's a challenge to get that chair tape woven tightly enough that it'll hold. And if you buy a kit nowadays, the kit comes with a piece of foam rubber. So a padding that's, say, almost as thick or slightly thicker than the gap that will be between those layers of chair tape. But I also wonder if they didn't reweave and tighten up the tape periodically, just based on the dye patterns on some of those tapes. So I would put something like a flat cushion in the center, as light as possible, but that kind of shape. That would be my suggestion.
Okay. Any other questions for Melissa? Or comments or? I want to say before you leave that Melissa's going to do another program for us on April 20th, traditional knitting from England, Ireland, and Scotland. Melissa, do you want to talk a little bit about what that program's going to cover?
Sure. There are some really exciting traditions, and what we'll be looking at in that presentation is the ganzes that were knitted for sailors, the Aran jumpers that came later, and I'll dispel some of the myths and rumors surrounding the long history of Aran knitting. We'll look at Shetland knitting, both Shetland lace and also the beautiful Fair Isle color work that comes from Shetland and Fair Isle. And I'll have lots of historic photos as well as modern pictures of modern interpretations of those types of designs.
We're all very excited for that, Melissa. This sounds great. Someone is complimenting you on your shawl, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I dyed this yarn and I knit my little shawl.
It's really neat. All right, everyone, thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you back on April 20th.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye-bye.